Excellent. The mall is so good. Honestly, my younger brothers joined me for the last leg of research. I'll take a second to just tell you guys what I'm doing in case you're like, yeah, right, bullshit. No. um, so I do, oops, I'm going to do a screen share at a certain point. Let's see here. Screen share. Awesome. So if you're here, hopefully it's because you're here for officially our uh, 13th class together. We are at the midway point. If you recall, I was at a research conference last week, and then I was at something called the Reservation Economic Summit. I think I'm going to prepare a tiny uh, kind of highlight post to share with you guys when we come together all in person. Because honestly, I'm still thinking in kind of the really cool things that I've done since I saw you guys last. I was fortunate enough to attend this Reservation Economics Summit that's convened every year. It's about 5,000 people from all the different tribes in the United States come together to talk about what economic development looks like in Indian country. And um, obviously, casinos are a huge part of many tribes' economic strategies. So coming together in the kind of sacred city of casinos is something every year we do, but it's this networking opportunity as well as a chance to really reflect on what you as a tribe are doing. And I'm actually, and have been for the last 6 months, the president of the Yurok Tribes Economic Development Corporation, which is the portion of my tribe that owns all of our for-profit enterprises, which includes a small casino and hotel on the reservation, as well as a handful of other for-profit businesses, including a gas station, um, other things that are sometimes the only thing like it for miles and miles. And so, in some ways, it's very much a community service, just as much as it is trying to be a means of one day restoring our ability to provide for ourselves. Because my tribe, even though we are the largest tribe and one of the pioneers of so much in the state and across the nation, we're also the poorest tribe in California. And we are 90% dependent on federal funding, which is already a risky situation. But as you can imagine, in current days, it's even more tenuous. And so, in some ways, though, that is a direct reflection of how Yurok has moved when it comes to economic development, that we have prioritized who we are as a people and what has always mattered to us over the bottom line. And actually, we spent a lot of our time fighting for things that don't have a numeric value, including the removal of 4 dams along the Klamath River. That was a battle that took place over decades and actually culminated this year when the Klamath was once again flowing freely because the last dam had come down, something people said was once be impossible. And so I actually got to tell that story from my tribe's perspective, along with some other community leaders. And it was just a really, really affirming experience. And then I got to take that hat off and jump into my currently, I'm working on my book, right, which is about tribal fathers and criminal records, prisoner reentry, basically a reservation version of this class with a focus on their meaning making and roles as fathers and providers. Then missing and murdered, which I've shared about. But I also study festivals and the place of Las Vegas itself as what I call a liminal space, which is inherently the spaces that are in between. You never stay in a liminal space long, but there are also places where like a lot can happen. As sociologists, we've studied different parts of it, whether that's the collective effervescence and the meaning making that is kind of shared in that somewhat ritual space. Um, so I went to the Rolling Loud Festival in Los Angeles for the first time. That's the first festival of a sequence of 3 that I will go to this year in my second year of observation for this project. So being back here in the classroom it feels like I've lived a couple lifetimes in the best way. But I wanted to say a big thank you to all of you guys for letting that be possible. I've said in the past that I've tried to do both when I go to this conference, to have lecture and participate. And this was the first year I really gave myself permission to fully be present and it really paid off in terms of the quality of the experience. And I couldn't be more grateful to each of you for your part in that. So when we come back together after spring break, we will kind of, you'll get to see maybe some pictures and some points on that. But hopefully you spent that time well. And today we're coming back together with our regularly scheduled content, which includes single moms as a part of multiple partner fertility. Now, before I totally jump into lecture, I'd love to pause, see if there's any announcements, comments for the good of the group. As a small point to everyone, we will meet on Zoom again. I will be at my home office, and I actually can't wait to show you guys my cool background. So you'll see me that day. But today will be video off for bandwidth too. I'm hoping I'm not too choppy. But let me just pause real quick before we jump into content. Are there any announcements or comments, questions for the good of the group? Something in the chat. Attendance. I love the question about attendance. What's way cool about Zoom is it tells us who's all here and for how long. It keeps a report on my end. So whenever I have Zoom, that's actually a really cool function of it. So we don't have to actually do it. And what's cool is we have 44 here. I'm thinking that includes myself and the TA. It's okay if it doesn't say your full name. I'll probably be in touch if I have questions. I have a pretty good guess as to who's talking now. Yep, figured. So we'll know your grades. We're shooting for the end of the month. Hopefully the time we all come together, you guys will see your grades coming back. We've had a couple, we had most of them submitted, so most everyone will see those. Are the lecture slides uploaded to CAT courses yet? They are not. These ones aren't uploaded yet. I can't remember if I uploaded the last ones when we came together, but these ones definitely aren't. So you'll see these shortly. Good question. Yeah, that's it. We'll be in touch more if we have questions about grading. If you currently have an email sent to me since basically this time last week, I have not been able to reply, but if you did have an extension request previous to last Wednesday, I would say that should have been granted. But most importantly, just get those papers in when you can. That's always the most important thing. And we will grade them in a rolling fashion. If you've already submitted it, you're going to see yours, ideally, by when we come together at the end of the month. Well, it'll be actually April 1st will be our next time all together. Thank you for that question. Awesome. Well, then we are going to go ahead and jump in and do a quick time check. We may or may not go the full class hour today. But as a brief recap, I do just kind of want to give you a sense of where we are in the course, because obviously we took some time apart. But if you think of the real story we've been building, we know that when we look at urban inequality, it's not as simple as X causes Y. There's many X's, there's many Y's. Now Y is kind of causing X, and there's some Z's involved too. I'm obviously using these letters as stand-ins for different factors, both cause and consequence of this phenomenon, which we know can kind of sometimes be lumped into the broad categories of structure and culture. As we learn more about how these things impact kind of the neighborhood and kind of urban experience at large, we then started to hone in on what does that look like for individuals, because we know that we all have a certain level of agency and autonomy, that our life outcomes are not merely a reflection of the world around us. That we have some impact on that, obviously, but it is different and shaped by the world you come up in. And if you come up in a community that's marked by fundamentally a lack of resources, whether that's economic, social, these things have qualitative impacts across the life course, starting in schooling, then later in the workforce. But it also impacts how people relate to one another on their very base, a very base level. Now, this includes how people kind of make meaning of their aspirations and the dreams, right? The Minds of Marginalized Black Men being one of the earlier books we touched on. And this week, last time we came together, we were talking about making ends meet and how this has been largely studied from the perspective of single mothers because of how frequently single parents are the kind of formation that we see in households in these communities. It's not to say that fathers and other kind of male relatives aren't a part of their lives. They're actually a huge part of their ability to make ends meet on any given day. But the ways in which people partner looks different than it did 20, 30, 50 years ago. That's obviously not just the case for low income families. That's the case for all humans in Western society, America being one example. But we know, though, that if this family formation was not associated with negative outcomes, we could kind of leave it off the table as a point of consideration. But we do unfortunately know the opposite is true, that having one parent is associated with a host of negative outcomes, such that it has been a point of policy intervention and a point of theoretical kind of discussion. So I want to, if you'll recall, Kathy Edin has been an important voice in this discussion for decades now. Her Making Ends Meet is one of the first examples where we get the perspective of mothers on this kind of culmination of circumstances. But then she continues that line of inquiry for decades to come. Last time learning about extreme poverty, right, being defined as less than $2 cash per day to live on. And then in this week's readings, we learned from her work with Maria Kefalas about single mothers and what parenthood means to them, what marriage means to them, and how these things have in some ways been decoupled. And it's not for lack of meaning, but rather the opposite. And then next time on Thursday's class, we're going to look at her work with her husband, Tim Nelson, on the perspective of the fathers. So if you've been wondering, where are the dads in this story? Where is that perspective? In some ways, we need more of those books. My work speaks to that from a different population's perspective, and Tim Nelson and Kathy's work is furthering kind of that inquiry, but it is in many ways kind of catching up to what we know about single mothers at large. So I'm going to now pause the recording so that we don't have any problems with our YouTube. What's different, but the setting I'm looking for, I don't want to be like, I hardly find that when it's just me talking to my computer, like when you Zoom from home and you want to display something but have the audio off from the microphone. But the logistics of finding that with these headphones, we're not meant to see it today. That's okay. We'll see it afterwards. Excuse me. Thank you guys for weighing in. Now, promises I can keep. This is actually a book I would have to say is one of the first ones I read early in my grad career. I actually, I don't know if I shared this when we worked or learned from Kathy previously, but I was recruited to Harvard to be the student of Kathy Edin and William Julius Wilson. And she, at the time, as professors are wont to do, sometimes go to other universities. And, it's nothing personal, but basically, as soon as the paper ink was dry on mine, she was signing her own contract to go work at Johns Hopkins University and then later Princeton University. And so, in one hand, you could be like, oh, damn, that kind of sucks. But actually, what was cool was I got to continue working with her and wound up getting to meet 2 departments worth of other scholars because I continued to work with her as a research assistant. She was on my committee formally as an undergrad and then, or excuse me, as a master's student, and then again at the dissertation level. So I, in many ways, consider myself a student of Bill Wilson, but also very much a student of Kathy Edin. And it is because when you look at the kind of scope of portrayals of people from low-income communities, I just really always wanted to I wanted to be able to emulate those scholars who held space for the humanity of the people they studied. Not all scholars do that or do that well. And I actually always found that Kathy was very purposeful in how she approached this. I think you can tell when she speaks on this subject. And just having known and worked with her personally, she is someone who, um, when they talk about allies and people who can use their position to really uphold and uplift voices, she's someone who spent a career doing that, and it's really, really quite admirable. And we've had the benefit of learning from her before, so you might actually recognize some of how she went about doing this. Um, now, in Promises I Can Keep, as well as Making Ends Meet, which we read in our last week together, she is primarily using qualitative methodologies, right? Largely in-depth, extensive interviews. Now, a lot of times when people do interviews, it's not an, especially when you're spending upwards of 5 or 10 hours with one person over all the course of the interviews and observation periods, you might you could very much see the rationale that you might have 30 or 50 or even 100 cases, and that is gonna have just hundreds and hundreds of audio data, never mind all the other notes and observations that go with that. What's cool about Kathy's work, and this is in some ways why I got to work with her in other respects, is that would they were so effective as a team in the making ends meet work that they have perennially been able to get the funding and the resources to do multi-city, multi-stage investigations of families living in these kind of low income areas that are like fleets, literally fleets of grad students kind of conducting interviews. And then when it goes into the coding phase, having those same people or others code the data. And so there is like a research apparatus that is almost unparalleled, one would say, in the social sciences. And a large part of what we know is based on this really, really expansive, um, in-depth how and why investigation, which is predicated on what we know that, these areas are marked by certain conditions. And that's why it would make sense to dig deeper into the stories and the narratives of the people living there. And so in this book, uh, roughly 25 years ago now, they were talking to 162 single mothers, of which 39% were Black, 32% were white, 29% Hispanic, and approximately the average age was 26. Now, 75% had a child when they were younger than 19, 20% had a child when they were younger than 15. Now, this was on purpose. They were trying to look at what had been really, really lambasted, one could say, by like right wing conservatives, both politicians and the media, about how poverty and the poor outcomes we're seeing in certain communities is actually just a reflection of poor choices, and that one of those things being teenage pregnancy. Uh, Now, at the same time, teenage pregnancy had, for a brief period, seen a decline. And then there was in other places, either that decline never happened or there started to be an increase. And so there was a real question as to why this was happening and what did this mean for those actually experiencing it. Now, as a first order concern, there was the kind of expectation that being a teenage mother, or at least a young mother, would mean that their economic prospects were negatively impacted, or the minimum they would be on some kind of public aid recipient. And that was the case for at least half their sample, 49% of whom were at the time receiving AFDC, and 19% though, or 1 out of 5, were working full time, which, if you recall from the Making Ends Meet book, this kind of working poor space of being, just making too much to be on welfare or having timed out of welfare and having to meet certain minimum working requirements. But then at the same time, you will lose your access to healthcare, to food stamps, and to other support programs if your full-time work ever brings you above a certain kind of income level. And so really feeling stuck or trapped in that space is also kind of an experience that they were trying to speak to, and to what extent motherhood was a qualitative factor that impacted that either positively or negatively. Now, each of these individuals, these 162 mothers, they participated in at least 2 interviews. And those are in-depth interviews, right? So we're thinking 2 hours minimum, maybe longer. But beyond that, and much like the Making Ends Meet, where they went and they lived in the community, they were raising their kids. I can tell a really kind of embarrassing story, actually. I had always heard that Kathy lived and took her kids to do all this research with her. And I don't want to be like, maybe she's just really well preserved. I just didn't appreciate how old she was in like a lifetime way. And so when I got to go, they had this big research thing where they brought us all down to Baltimore, and we got to be at her house, and like they had this big dinner, and I'm in the kitchen. It's a social event, right? A bunch of scholars just hanging. And so we're in the kitchen, and I'm going to get a glass of wine, and there's like 4 or 5 glasses on the table. Um, and I'm going to tell you guys the full story. My cheeks are blushing as I say it. Um, uh, I was talking to this beautiful young lady who was giving me wine recommendations, and I'll drink anything red, really, but beyond that, I don't know too much. And so I just really, oh, okay, this is cool. And she taught me all about all the wine, all this kind of stuff. And then later we were going to do introductions around the whole room, and it comes to light that this is actually Kathy's daughter. And she was giving me wine recommendations. She's obviously at least a seasoned wine drinker. I think at the time I was like 25, 26, maybe 27. Uh, but in no way did I think Kathy Eden's child that I'd heard about was old enough to be giving me wine recommendations and having a full function conversation. So I blurt out, "Oh my God, that's your kid." Uh, but it was even more awkward because no one tells you that Kathy had adopted her children, and they are actually not phenotypically the same. So the amount of tasting my own foot in my mouth that happened was quite embarrassing. But it's also a funny anecdote, only because it was like, gosh, I know you guys are thinking why I said that, but I didn't know her children were fully functioning. I have learned about her, basically carrying her kids around as a way to relate to her study participants. But kids also grow up. And so by the time she was doing the Promises I Can Keep work, they were probably almost in college themselves. And so she wasn't necessarily living in the community and participating alongside the mothers as she had been in Making Ends Meet, but she was still nonetheless like making. They lived in the community. The research assistants, the people who were conducting the interviews, they would actually like rent out entire apartment buildings for their research assistants, and live there on site for months at a time. And they also did home observations. So this is and I take time to kind of speak on methods, because when it comes to the final project, you have a chance to talk about methods if you'd so like. Um, but when you do interviews, unfortunately, there is often the criticism made that how do you know people, what they say is true? How do you know that? People could say anything, right? So how did you do your due diligence to make sure what they're saying lines up with what is actually happening in reality? This is some of the ways you can do that by having an ethnographic component, an observation component, and that's what we see in the work by Kathy and Maria here. Um, and that means that what they find holds, I would say, even more weight than if they had perhaps just interviewed people by themselves, or arguably if they just stick to the numbers and really just try to, draw some kind of lines between the statistical demographic characteristics they were finding and the outcomes of they were observing. Instead, they're really triangulating a qualitative experience that is speaking on what it is like to be a single mother and a teenage mother, knowing full well that is going to be associated with certain lifetime kind of conditions. So essentially, they're also trying to investigate whether or not William Julius Wilson's hypothesis, which is, kind of been pushed and prodded over the years, but he has always essentially posited that much of the differences in marriage that we see in low-income communities, essentially the lack of marriage or the drop-off of marriage, even more extreme than American culture at large, that is a direct reflection of what he called the marriageable man pool. That even with the negative conditions impacting low-income communities, the women in these places were still able to find good lives, whether that was through the meaning of being mothers, whether it was being able to make it all the way to college, to make it out, so to speak. The differences in outcomes and the social mobility of women versus men was such that they were essentially outpacing their peers. When it came to the women in these communities, the men that they would want to marry were not keeping pace with them economically, education wise, anything like that. And so the prospects of being married to a man who was not in that same, perhaps, league, I guess you could say, that's what the deficit is. That's what the problem is. Personal commentary notwithstanding, they had never actually proven that this. No one ever asked any women in these communities, why is it that you're still having children, you're still finding meaning as a mother, but we don't see wife and kind of that cohabitation that had been the norm for so long in all of America, and these communities included. Now they essentially find that while the practical significance of marriage is diminished, as in men no longer are the primary breadwinner, women, even if you wanted to stay home, most cities, demand kind of a two-person earner home, two-earner home. But at the same time, we're not maybe held out of the economy in the same way we once were. We're able to get the same, like I said, right? In some ways, women are outpacing men in lots of ways. So the practical functionality of marriage has greatly diminished to the betterment of all. But in some ways, its symbolic significance had grown. That meant that while marriage no longer was necessary for keeping the lights on and keeping the food in the fridge and things like that, the meaning that it did have became somehow more, because it was only symbolic. It was something that meant something intangibly, and in that way the way people sought it out or did not also changed. Now, one could say, why do we care about people getting married? Is increasing marriage even a reasonable solution to any of the problems that we've been studying this semester? Even though we know single earner homes associated with a bunch of negative outcomes, is marriage necessarily a solution that we want to pursue? Now, we're going to kind of come back to this later in the semester when we talk about policy solutions, but I do kind of want to offer that up to the group just mentally, and we'll kind of come back to this next time, is think of the instances in which marriage might actually be not good, or why incentivizing marriage could also produce other outcomes. In some ways, what we saw as marriage became less practically necessary, we also saw, in some ways, kind of the violence that could be associated with marriage go away. That they found that the women in these communities were often able to leave at the first sign of mistreatment, let alone physical violence. And so their desire to marry could also be a reflection of their bodily autonomy and safety that is very important and not something that we'd want to give up, regardless of what we could incentivize or what could be gained from having two people in a home, contributing to the finances. But that is something we will come back and speak on when we have a time as a group together. Now, what they really found is that the most important difference, because again, they were trying to engage with what people were really pointing to, like, look, we've seen teenage pregnancy not only not go away, but almost go up in certain communities. It much like the poverty or the drug use. Oh, it's automatically seen as some kind of deviant behavior that people in these communities do this because they don't value the same things. And actually, once again, we find the opposite to be true. Not only do they value the same things, but they value them sometimes even more, but differently. The most important difference is that the poor ascribe a higher value to children than members of the middle class do. The poor view childlessness as one of the greatest tragedies in life. Female high school dropouts are more than 5 times as likely, and male dropouts more than 4 times as likely to say they think childless people lead empty lives. So we're going to get back to the marriage point shortly, but this is an explanatory factor as to why you might see childbearing continue even as other social institutions change or fall away, whether that's marriage or cohabitation, male breadwinners, what have you. There's also this underlying difference as to how children are valued, the meaning making that is derived from being a parent, either mother or father, and what child rearing can symbolize, particularly in the absence of other opportunities to actualize self worth or meaning making. The public often assumes that early childbearing is the main reason why so many girls from poor inner cities fail to complete high school, go on to college, gain valuable work skills, or earn decent wages. But there's literally no evidence to support this idea. Disadvantaged girls who bear children have about the same long term earning trajectories as similarly disadvantaged youth who wait until their mid or late 20s to have a child. Their social context has already diminished their life chances so much that an early birth does little to reduce them much further. Now, what does this mean? This means that, like I said, when we're looking, I don't watch Fox News much, but let's say we're watching some kind of conservative social commentary, it wouldn't be unreasonable at some point in the broadcast probably to see certain social things, like, right, they're gonna talk about what is causing the unemployment and the poverty and the negative outcomes we're seeing. And that the teen moms are going to get never the teen dads, or if they do, it's usually it's blaming the victim. No matter who they point to, they blame those in this situation for their circumstance, and they tie it to some of the more personal choices, becoming parents. But as they found in this work, and really through a canvassing of all the work on these, kind of what we know about their conditions broadly speaking, it's that if you're born into a community that already has such grievous outcomes on a day-to-day basis, not only is having a child one of the few ways you may find any form of meaning, it is something that's always readily available to you. And all else being equal, it won't actually take away that much from you. It will actually probably bring more to your life than not. Uh, and I think, you guys are all of the age where, like, Teen Mom was on MTV. Just, you guys probably were watching the rerun syndicated as you grew up, because it was like there's been a morbid fascination with low income mothers, and a real stigmatization, while at the same time constantly scrutinizing them. And that shouldn't be surprising then that we would blame them for their circumstances, their life outcomes, even though there actually is very little, if any, support to that claim. Now, the fragility of both marriage and cohabitation means that by age 15, only half of American children, all American children, mind you, live with both biological parents, whereas roughly 2/3 of Swedish, Austrian, German, and French children do, as do nearly 9 in 10 children in Spain and Italy. Now, like I said, this does not necessarily mean that we should seek out more cohabitation, more marriage as the end all be all. But it is interesting to see this very uniquely American phenomenon, at least as compared to other Western peers, that there is across the board a fragility of marriage and of cohabitation that's impacting all American families. And that means that in communities where many circumstances are overlapping, that's going to be especially true. But it's not necessarily going to be the thing that is explaining their negative outcomes. If anything, it's just a quality of life consideration. And really, at the end of the day, all else being equal, living apart from either biological parent at any point during childhood is what seems to hurt children. And so perhaps as we think of ways to address really the outcome of interest, right? That we're trying to intervene in outcomes. We know that children, there's more bang for your buck, as you could say that. And also, if we can head it off sooner, bad things won't get worse. And so childhood and the ways that, like, the resources you have access to growing up, if there was ways to make sure that regardless of your parents' relationship status, you were somehow shielded from the ramifications of living apart from them, what if there was ways to facilitate that? Creatively speaking, that is obviously a huge cultural intervention, but we as Americans are so set on, like, family's got to look a certain way, nuclear family this, man wife this, that, like, that's, we only see certain solutions because we're only willing to look through certain frames. And maybe if we were willing to kind of branch out more, we could find ways to better support the children in these homes. But we'd also be willing to think of, like, is marriage necessarily, like, should marriage and child like being procreation and marriage, why are those the metrics by which we assess personhood in the United States? Like, why do you have to have a child to have some meaning to society and to yourself? And or why do you have to be married to access social supports or to have the highest form of social prestige? Like, that's not actually the case in all countries. It's a unique American cultural fixation, one could say. And so, no commentary, good, bad, or ugly about it, just more so pointing out that that is actually a paradigm at the cultural, kind of social, highest level that really impacts how we see solutions, broadly speaking, but especially when we're looking at how to improve outcomes in low income areas. Now, as I said, I did not actually envision us going all the way to time. And I thought we'd finish around 1 because we get to watch that cool 6 to 7 minute video. So what I'm going to do now is kind of pivot to, we're going to formally close lecture. I'm going to also turn the recording off, and I will keep the Zoom running because